Welcome everyone to the Church Explained podcast, a conversation to grow your leadership and build your church. I'm Dave.
And I am Nathan, and we're the hosts of the Church Explained podcast, as always. And today we've been joined by Brandon Petty. And Brandon is the lead pastor and planter of Generation Church in Portland, Tennessee. Brandon was in youth ministry for over 14 years and has spoken at many different camps and conferences. Brandon is best known for his passion and the ability to include humour with real-life application to his messages. His testimony of surviving trauma and abuse as a child and his powerful story of redemption and purpose helps him connect with leaders of all ages. Brandon and his wife Jessica moved to Portland in 2011 with their two daughters to start Generation Church, which was included in Outreach magazine as one of the fastest growing churches in America in 2019. So Brandon, it's great to have you with us on the Church Explained podcast.
Honored to be a part. Thank you guys so much for asking.
Oh, yeah, so good to have you here, Brandon, and just like a little bit of your story there. We want to find out a little bit more of your story, of course, and just wonder, we always like to start off our podcast asking this question, Brandon. Tell us, we wouldn't say Brandon to everyone, like, of course, but to you today, just to make clear, tell us a little bit about your faith story, your ministry journey, a little bit about your background and family. I know you've said something in the bio, and whether you want to go into that, we'll leave that up to you. But yeah, we'd just like to find out a little bit more about you today.
Yep. Sure, yeah. I did not grow up in church. My mother she was pregnant with me when she was 15 years old. And so she dropped out of high school to help raise me, worked several jobs. And then a few years later, she had my brother. And so we kind of, I grew up, I tell people I grew up in a house full of women. I was raised by my mom, my grandmother, and my two aunts. And so I didn't know my biological father until I was 15. And but my mom, she walked through a lot of different relationships when I was a child. And so we were moved around a lot. Anytime people ask me where I'm from, I just say Middle Tennessee, because I pretty much lived in almost every city around in Middle Tennessee, in the Nashville area. And so with that came a lot of abuse, whether it was physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, all the things from the time I was probably 7 or 8 all the way up until I was 12 or 13. And so by the time I was 15, my mother ended up in prison for drugs. And so I had to move in with my aunt and uncle. And so I lived with them through high school. And I always tell people that that in high school I had a drug problem. I was drugged to church every single Sunday by my aunt and uncle. That was one of the stipulations living in their home, is that we had to attend church. And so didn't catch on right away. I actually, it was a small little rural church out in the middle in Kentucky, in a rural area of Kentucky. And I could not stand church at all. And then, God miraculously, when I was 18, right after I graduated high school, God just radically saved me and changed me. And immediately I began working in student ministry. Amazing. And I actually, about a year later, when I was 19, started preaching the gospel and started serving in student ministry. And I thought that I would be in student ministry for the rest of my life. I kind of envisioned myself being like in my 70s, still preaching to teenagers. People were like, one day you'll have your own church, one day you'll be a pastor. And I would just, in my mind, I would just be like, there's no way. Like I would say no to that in a heartbeat. But of course, in 2010, January 2010, God started wrecking my heart to plant a church. And so by January of 2011, we had transitioned out of our church as youth pastors and began the journey to start building a team and planting a church. And then on March 4th, 2012, we launched Generation Church out of a little elementary school here in the city of Portland. And we saw 482 people show up on our first day. And then 6 weeks later, we baptized 89 people at our first Easter service. And so ever since then, God has just been faithful. He's been so good. And so it's been an incredible journey, one that has obviously came with its up and downs. I'm sure we'll jump into that and dive into that. along in our conversation, especially when it comes to some of the trauma and stuff that I spoke about earlier and how it came back to revisit me in my adult years. But yeah, so now not only did we start the church with our 2 daughters, but in 2015, my wife gave birth to our son. So now we have 3 kids.
Wow.
So I got 2 teenage girls, so need lots of prayer there. And then of course I have an 8-year-old son who is just, he kind of rules the household. So
Yeah. Oh no, I relate to the youth pastor comment where you think you're going to be in student ministry for the rest of your life. Because yes, I was youth pastor, and yes, you do just think, do you know what, I'm in it for life. And then the day comes where you're like, no, not in it anymore, and it's very different. But also, Brandon, we love to ask this question: what do you do for fun?
Oh man, I absolutely love playing disc golf. Is disc golf very popular there?
Is that like the like with the frisbee
golf?
Yeah, yes, except for here, if you say frisbee, you'll get you get attacked pretty quickly.
Okay.
You don't say frisbee, you say disc. And but we have the chains and the goals that you throw them into. But that's pretty popular with our staff. But I love to work out. I'm a big gym rat, and then of course just love any kind of outdoor activities. I hunt, fish, camp, those type things. So
awesome.
Some interesting stuff there. Then disc. What's it called? Disc what?
Disc
golf. Disc golf.
Yes.
My apologies to all our American audience. It's the conversation between soccer and football, isn't it? All over again.
Yes. That's pretty much what it is. Yeah.
We'll say no more. Hey, great to hear about the church, and obviously God's blessing you there. And you, as you've described, that you've been working through some stuff. Lovely just to hear how God impacted your life at the age of 18, 19, just to take that sort of journey to follow Him. But I thought it would be good for us maybe just to get in a little bit now some of the questions around, like, how do you take care of yourself? You've mentioned, I know, the gym stuff, but how do you take care of yourself as you think about the church and this growing church that you're leading? Like what do you do? How do you take care of yourself, your family, your soul, your team?
Well, and interestingly enough, I didn't even really do anything for that until about 2015. We were like 3.5 years into the church plant, and it seemed like we went through about 1.5 years of just trial after trial, which when I look back now, I really believe it was God leading me to freedom and to health in my soul. My wife's brother, he was an alcoholic, and he ended up on basically his deathbed. He was on one of these rotating beds. He had almost drank himself to death. And they told us 3% of people end up getting out of those beds. And so during that time, it was like 3 or 4 months of us at the hospital every single day with her mom, her brother, praying for a miracle, which we received. 4 months later, he ended up walking out of the hospital, gave his heart and life to the Lord. So that was an incredible journey. But also during that same time period, my father passed away, and I had just began to restore our relationship as an adult. My son was just born, and my dad never got to see my son. He had a sudden heart attack a few months after his birth. And so that was kind of like a hard hit personally, because I was still trying to figure out my father wounds and those type things. And to cap it all off, I told you guys about, being a child at 8 years old, being sexually abused. I was actually forced to watch pornography at the age of 8. I don't know how raw this podcast is, so sorry if I get a little too long.
Go for it.
Sure, where you're at.
But when I was about 9, the second person to sexually abuse me was a neighbor, and he was a 16-year-old male. And so we come to church one day, and we drive up as a normal Sunday, and we're walking in, and I encounter a volunteer who is setting up our parking lot. And after a few minutes of this conversation, I realized that the person that I'm having a conversation with is the person that sexually abused me as a child. Wow. And so it was like a wave of grief that hit me in that moment of realizing, man, the guy that abused me is in my church, right?
Wow.
And so I went through a 3-month period of depression, anxiety. I would have nightmares that my son was going to be murdered or missing. And he was just a baby at the time. And I remember I would just daydream about different jobs that I could take. I was trying to figure out how I could offload this church to somebody else. I basically just went through a dark time of just not figuring out like what's wrong with me. What I would sneak in the back door of our church every Sunday, sneak out. I didn't want to encounter people. And my wife had known a lot about my childhood, but not a lot of details. Sure. And so I knew one of two things was going to happen. I'm either going to probably make decisions that are going to disqualify me from ministry. I'm going to quit ministry, or I'm going to get help. Like one of those three options. And so one day we were getting ready to go out, me and my wife, and I was so filled with shame over what happened to me as a child that I couldn't even look her in the face. And so I was in the shower. She was standing in the bathroom getting ready. And I just began to pour out my heart. And I'm uncontrollably sobbing at this point and trying to make a coherent speech. And you know what's incredible? This is what I encourage people all the time, is that the thing that we hold in, that we think is the thing that's going to make people ashamed of us or embarrassed of us, judge us, is actually the thing that leads to our freedom. Because once we confess it and get it out, it's no longer hidden in the dark, and it can't continue to grow. Wow. And man, that moment, my wife loved me with such great, it grew us closer together once I was able to be fully vulnerable and transparent with her, which was incredible. And so I know I'm kind of giving you guys the long version of this story.
No, go for it.
But several months into that, thank God I had a great network of pastors, friends, and networks around me who loved me and cared for me. And my wife encouraged me to reach out. And so I did. They paid for me to get counseling. They encouraged me to take some time off, which I did. And so I started going to counseling pretty heavy. I started reading books on sexual trauma. And probably one of the things that kind of kickstarted my soul health was I had a pastor friend who every year he did 2 weeks of a solitude sabbatical where he would just go off and he would just camp and fish and spend time with the Lord. And I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what it looked like. And so he invited me for a few days to come and just be with him as he did that. And from that point in 2015 on, every year I do that myself. I take a solitude sabbatical. And that first one in 2015, guys, I'm telling you, it was, oh my gosh, it was truly an encounter with God, because I had finally began a journey. Here's what I believe. I believe a lot of people experience survival in their life, but never fully experience victory. Wow. And what I had come to realize is I had survived a lot as a kid, but I didn't have victory over hardly any of it. And I think we think that sometimes time will erase our pain. Yeah. And I believe why we think that is because we think that our past will never come knocking on our door in the future. But what really struck me was that I never expected my past to show back up. But it didn't just show back up emotionally or mentally. It showed back up physically. The person was standing right in front of me.
Yeah, wow.
And I'll never forget what my counselor said. He asked me this strange question that I thought was a strange question from a counselor. He said, "Do you think you could whip this guy?" And I was like, this is a weird turn into the session. And I said, well, yeah, I'm not trying to brag or anything, but yeah, I can whip him. He's older than me now. He's a lot older than me. And he said, well, then you need to go tell your 10-year-old self that you're safe. You're good. And I just remember thinking, like, I hadn't realized, because he explained, he said, the reason why you're having these dreams about your son, the reason why, you're walking through this, is because the moment you saw him, you reverted back to that 9 or 10-year-old that and you were experiencing as an adult through the eyes of that child.
Wow.
And he's like, you need to tell that child you're okay. And I'll never forget leaving that session. I sat in my car and I just chose, because people kept trying to give me all the advice in the world. You should kick him out of the church. You should do this. You need to sit down and have a conversation. And the hard part is it wasn't just about me and him anymore. He had kids. He had grandkids.
Wow.
He had like relationships. And so like, do I bring this to light and then start affecting all these other relationships? Or do I go on this? Because it wasn't even about him and I. What I came to realize is it was about my own journey toward finding healing in my soul. And so from that point forward, I began implementing slowly, because I read the book, The Life You've Always Wanted by John Ortberg on that first sabbatical. And man, it led me down this beautiful journey to establishing practices of Sabbath, of solitude, silence, prayer, like really creating space and margin in my life to be in the presence of God. Because I'll be ashamed to say and tell you guys, like, I think a lot of pastors, because I did it, will lead their churches for a long time off of their gifting. But eventually your character will catch up, and your soul, your essence, your being, or your ethos, as that word is described in the Greek, it will eventually come out and reveal what's really hidden within. And I'm grateful that God took me through that journey, because I tell people, like, if it wasn't for that moment, I don't know where I would be today. I don't know what my marriage would look like. I don't know what the church would look like. And so for me, even now, it's morphed into where 8 years later, I just did my first silent retreat at a monastery. Wow. So silence and solitude have become a big part of my soul health. The sabbatical once a year has been a big part. I do at least 2 retreats with other pastors and leaders every year. Getting ready to go to Montana in May for a pastor's retreat where we'll just, we'll fly fish and spend time in Montana. And so that and prayer it's vital. And so my first 2 hours of the day are spent in prayer, in the word, in silence. So to answer your question in the long form, those are the ways that I take care of my soul, is just being in the presence of God as often and consistently as I can be, and making that a routine and a habit and a practice of my life. So,
well, just want to firstly say thank you for sharing your story with us, and that story, I believe that'll just be helpful to other people around there. I wonder if you just paint a little bit of context of what was happening in the church. So obviously you mentioned you were coming in and out, but was the church still growing? Was it still moving forward?
So ironically, about year 3 of when all this started happening is when our church plateaued and started to decline a little bit. And about a year and a half later, so by 2017, the church started growing again. And I tell people the moment I got healthy is when the church started to get healthy. And I'll never forget what my counselor told me. He said, once you walk through this and find healing, he said, you'll become a better communicator of the gospel. He said, now you have tasted grace tangibly, firsthand, of what it's like to forgive, of what it's like to show grace and receive grace. And so I truly believe that was a turning point in my life and the church's life. And even 5 years later, what we're experiencing right now, I tell people this is the harvest of a field that God had to plow in my own heart 5 years ago. I think sometimes when we're walking through a season of blessing, we think it just happened overnight. But really it's cultivated with seeds of prayer, with seeds of healing, with seeds of repentance and confession. And those things come to fruit in our lives much later than we anticipate.
Yeah, I mean, that's some great stuff you've said there. And as Nathan said, thanks for sharing your story and being so vulnerable before people, because I think it will really help people.
Yeah.
We don't know who's listening to this podcast, and we pray it will just help them as well, just to hear your story. And that story of redemption is an ongoing story, isn't it? God helps us and works in our life. One of the things you said there, well, there's a couple of things I just want to pick up on.
Yeah.
One is you mentioned this idea of, like, when you got healthy, the church get healthy. I think that's essential.
Yeah.
And then the other thing you've mentioned there is this idea of creating margin. I wonder if you could maybe speak into that a little bit. One, like you've mentioned about your journey of getting healthy, what would you encourage people to do? And two, how do you practically create margin on a daily basis?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And I think the simple answer is start somewhere. I think a lot of people feel like when it comes to, prayer time, margins, it's like they try to bite off more than they can chew in the beginning. I love this story. I don't know if you guys have heard this story, but they did this study, and they introduced a bicycle that when you turned left with the handlebars, the wheel actually turned right.
Okay.
And the study was to see like how long it would take somebody to relearn to ride a bike, right? And so this gentleman hops on. It takes him 8 months to learn how to ride this bike, right? And then the kicker was they gave it to his young son. And do you want to guess how long it took his young son to ride this bike?
8 minutes.
Well, it took 2 weeks. But the point was,
I was just going for a number 8 there.
No, I get, but you understood where I was going with that.
Yeah.
The longer we create habits in our lives, the longer it takes to deform those habits.
Sure.
And so when somebody is starting out, you can't just say, well, I'm going to get up, because it started with gradual stuff for me. I'll tell you, I used to be the most unorganized person. I was the person that I would hit my snooze 48 times before I got up in the morning. But now, I'm a person who gets up at 4 a.m. on the first time the alarm goes off. There's a great book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, but it really is creating the habits that lead to the habit, if that makes sense. And so, I get ready for my day the night before. I establish routines and that took time. And there was times where that wasn't perfect. And so what I had to do, what I would encourage people is like, start slow, start somewhere, give yourself grace. And I think we underestimate what can be done in a long period of time, and we overestimate what can be done in a short period of time. And so what people tend to do is go, man, I want to be, it's everything in our culture is about quick fix. I mean, you've heard probably of like 30 days to wholeness, or fit in 40. And so I told our church, I'm not trying to get you 30 days to wholeness. I'm trying to get you 30 years to wholeness. And so what can my life look like in a year if I stay consistent with these small practices, and then add on to it? So maybe instead of saying I'm going to get up 2 hours earlier, say I'm going to get up 20 minutes earlier, and here's how I'm going to spend that 20 minutes, and here's how that's going to play out. And then after 6 months, add another 10 minutes. And so sometimes you have to set the goal and then work backwards. If the goal is one day I want to get up at 4 a.m., but right now you get up at 7 a.m. Well, then maybe you need to back it up to 6. And then after a year, back it up to 5, and then back it up to 4. Because the whole point shouldn't be getting up early. The point should be that I'm becoming a person who spends the first part of their day with the Lord. And if that becomes my goal, then all the other stuff that's trivial anyways. And it really isn't, because you can be a morning person and still not be a person who starts their day off correctly or starts the day off in the right mood. And so I think for a lot of people, it's understanding, like, if you have spent the first 30 years of your life getting up at the last minute, pushing the snooze button 10 times, that's not going to fix itself in a month. And so to start practically, it starts small, start somewhere, give yourself grace. And eventually, you don't want to just give yourself margin. You want to become the kind of person that creates margin. And that's the difference in the mindset. You know, it's not just doing the stuff, but it's becoming the kind of person that does those things.
Brilliant. Hey, well, thanks for sharing those.
Yeah, Brandon, it's been so great to have you
Awesome.
on the podcast. What's the best way for people to connect with you?
Sure. If people are interested, I have a podcast called Made to Win.
It's a good podcast.
And you can go to madetowinpodcast.com if you want to engage there. You can check that out also on Spotify, iTunes, and YouTube. And then, of course, I'm on Instagram and Facebook. That's B Petty GC on Instagram, and of course Brandon Petty on Facebook. So those are 3 of the easiest ways to connect with me.
Great.
And we'll stick those in the show notes.
Yes, we will. Yeah, and
Awesome.
well, like we said, Brandon, it's been so great to have you on the podcast, and thanks everyone for listening. And remember to support what we're doing. Remember to share, subscribe, leave a review wherever you're consuming this content. Don't forget we have a whole load of resources for you and your church at icon.church/open. But we look forward to seeing you next time on the Church Explained podcast. We'll see you soon.